What appeared in the official Imperial records was a brief administrative entry under the heading of Strategic Reallocation. The Sol campaign was reclassified as a preliminary survey mission that had identified the target zone as geologically unsuitable for the intended extraction operation. The 200 vessels lost in the first wave were listed under a column called Navigation Casualty, with a code number attached that technically meant equipment failure in deep space. The Grand Armada's return was logged as a routine exercise completion. The paperwork was very clean. The truth was messier, and the truth traveled the way truths always travel when powerful institutions try to suppress them. Through the back channels, through the traders, through the crew members on 100 different ships who had stood on 100 different bridges and watched 40,000 of their vessels turn around from a yellow star in the outer spiral, because a small, unknown species on a small, unremarkable planet had looked at the most powerful military force in the galaxy and said no. You could not contain a story like that. Within 6 months, the account had reached 100 systems. Within a year, it had reached 1,000. And in each system it landed, it did something that the Celestial Empire's 12,000 years of unbroken dominance had trained everyone to believe was not possible. It made people think. On a cold planet called Veth Sira, in the 3rd sector, a resistance leader named Oru had spent 20 years trying to keep together a movement that was slowly dying under the weight of hopelessness. His people had been under Imperial occupation for 3 generations, long enough that most of the young ones had never known anything else, and had quietly started to believe that the Empire was simply the permanent condition of the universe, the way gravity was a permanent condition, something you could resent but not resist. Heard the story of Earth from a cargo pilot who had heard it from a port official, who had heard it from someone who claimed to have been a sensor operator on one of the ships in the Grand Armada. And for the first time in a long time, he sat very still and felt something warm moving in his chest. The story was not about weapons, he decided. Or rather, it was about weapons, but that was not the important part. The important part was the 72 hours. The fact that a species facing 40,000 ships had taken 6 hours to respond, and had spent those 6 hours not crying or praying or trying to negotiate from a position of terror, but working, building, preparing, thinking, refusing to accept that the outcome was already decided just because the other side was bigger. He sent a message to 12 other resistance cells across the 3rd sector, using an encryption method they had not changed in 8 years, because there had not seemed to be a reason to put energy into. The message said only, "Have you heard about the humans?" All 12 responses came back within 2 days. They all said yes. On a water world called Pelagus in the 7th sector, a species of deep ocean beings called the Veth had been paying Imperial resource tax for 2 centuries, surrendering the mineral deposits of their ocean floor on a schedule that left their own civilization permanently resource poor and permanently dependent on Imperial goodwill for the technology they needed to maintain their underwater cities. A young Veth engineer named Silas, the name was a translation approximation of a sound that meant something like "one who measures depth" in the original language, had been quietly running calculations in her personal time for 3 years on the question of what it would take for her civilization to build an independent energy infrastructure that would free them from the dependency. The calculations had always come back with answers too large to act on alone. When she heard the story of Earth, she did not focus on the battle. She focused on the 40 years. On the fact that a species had looked at a problem that seemed impossibly large, and had simply started working on it, and had not stopped for 4 decades, generation after generation, passing the project forward like a gift to children who would finish what their parents had begun. She pulled up her calculations and looked at them with different eyes. Then she opened an encrypted channel to a colleague on the far side of Pelagus and said, "I have a project I want to tell you about." Back on Earth, none of this was visible yet. The signals were too faint, too spread out, too buried in the ordinary noise of a galaxy going about its business. But Okafor had her antenna pointed in the right directions, and she was patient, and she was listening. She had set up a monitoring station on the far side of the moon, specifically to track the kinds of communications that traveled in the channels that desperate people used when they did not want to be heard by the wrong ears. It was quiet work, slow work, the kind of work that did not produce results for months at a time, and then suddenly produced more than you could process at once. She was sitting in that station on a clear autumn night when the first real signal came in. It was heavily encoded, from a direction that corresponded roughly to the third sector, and it was not a message intended for Earth. It was a fragment of a conversation between two people she did not know yet, about a movement that was just beginning to find its legs. And buried in the middle of it was a phrase that made her stop and read the translation twice. The phrase was, "like the humans did." She sat with that for a long time. Outside the station window, the sky above the far side of the moon was full of stars, dense and permanent, and beautiful in the way things are beautiful when you understand how much is happening inside them. And she thought about what it meant to be a symbol, to have the weight of other people's hope attached to your existence by people you had never met and would probably never meet. It was a weight she had not anticipated when she was drafting responses in the command center during the crisis, focused entirely on the immediate problem of the Grand Armada and whether her words could make 40,000 ships stand still. Now the words were still moving, still spreading, still doing work she had not assigned them. Harlow found her there an hour later. He had come to check on the monitoring station, as he sometimes did in the evenings, and he found her sitting at her console with all the screens dark, except one, which showed the decoded fragment on a pale background. He read it over her shoulder and was quiet for a moment. "Like the humans did," he said. "Yes," she said. "Is that a good thing?" Thought about it honestly. About the responsibility that came with being a story that gave desperate people courage. About the possibility that some of those people would attempt things they were not ready for and fail in ways that had consequences. About the gap between being an example and being an ally, and the question of whether Earth was prepared to become more than just a story to the rest of the galaxy. "I think it's a true thing," she finally said. "Whether it's good depends on what we do next." Harlow sat down in the chair beside her and looked at the fragment on the screen. "Iron Veil was designed to protect a planet," he said slowly. "It was never designed to protect a movement." "No," Okafor agreed. "But the people who built it were humans. They planned for the problem they could see, not the ones they couldn't. That's what we always do. And when the problem we couldn't see becomes the problem we can see." She turned and looked at him with the kind of steadiness that came from having thought something through completely. "Then we start building something new," she said, "the same way we always have, from the beginning, with the time we have, for the people who come after us." Outside the station, the moon was silent and gray and permanent, and beyond it, the solar system was quiet, its hidden network of weapons and sensors and patient infrastructure watching the dark the way it had always watched, waiting for whatever came next. The Celestial Empire had come to take a planet. They had left behind something they had not intended to leave, a proof, written in the physics of vanished ships and the memory of a fleet that turned around, that the galaxy's story was not finished, that the strong were not permanent, and that small things that refused to stop building eventually became something else entirely. The humans did not know what they were becoming yet, but they were becoming it. Quietly, patiently, with their hands full of tools and their eyes on the stars, the way they had always done everything that mattered. And that, more than the weapons, more than the victory, more than the retreating ships, was the thing that traveled furthest and lasted longest. That was the thing the galaxy would not forget. Vorakai's emergency transmission reached the Imperial capital in under 12 hours, and it caused the kind of disruption that most people who worked in those halls had never seen before in their lifetimes. The message was short and factual, and stripped of anything that could be interpreted as personal weakness, because Vorakai was too careful a commander to transmit weakness into a record that would be reviewed later. He reported the loss of 200 vessels to an unidentified weapons system, confirmed that no debris or wreckage had been recovered, noted the anomalous energy readings from within the Sol system, and formally requested authorization for full escalation, which in Imperial military language meant one specific thing. He was asking for the Grand Armada. The Grand Armada had been assembled in full exactly 4 times in the 12,000-year history of the Celestial Empire. It was not a fleet in any ordinary sense, but rather the total sum of Imperial military power gathered into a single moving force, 40,000 warships drawn from every corner of the Empire's territory, a weapon of such scale that simply putting it in motion changed the political gravity of the galaxy. Every species that had sensors capable of detecting mass FTL movement saw it leave. The galaxy watched in a silence that was not calm, but the specific kind of silence that falls when something very large is about to happen, and everyone watching knows it, but nobody says anything, because saying it makes it more real. 40,000 ships crossed the galaxy toward a small yellow star in the outer spiral. In the Sol system, the news arrived before the fleet did, carried by passive long-range sensors that Iron Veil had placed in deep space for exactly this purpose. Sensors that looked like natural objects, that transmitted in frequencies that nothing organic was supposed to be listening on, that had been sitting in the dark for 30 years doing their quiet work without ever being detected. The data came into the command center beneath the Alps and was processed and displayed on the main wall in under 2 minutes, and the room got very quiet, in the same way rooms get quiet when a number appears on a screen that is much larger than anyone had planned for, even in their worst-case scenarios. 40,000, Colonel Adayinka said, reading the sensor estimate with a voice that was professionally flat, but not entirely steady. Confirmed, said 3 other stations almost simultaneously. Harlow looked at the number for a long moment, not with fear exactly, because fear was a response to surprise, and this was not a surprise. The escalation protocols had always assumed that a first contact that went badly for the attacker would produce a larger second response, and the planners of Iron Veil had built the network's capacity to answer that larger response. But knowing something is coming, and seeing the actual size of it on a screen, were 2 different experiences. Dr. Okafor, he said. She was already at her station, already working, her coffee long since forgotten on a counter somewhere behind her. I know, she said without looking up. I'm building the message now. What Okafor was building was not a weapon and not a defense. It was a sentence, or rather, a sequence of sentences, that had to accomplish something much harder than destruction. It had to make 40,000 ships stand still, using nothing but words and timing. She had been thinking about this moment for most of her career, because the real insight Okafor had, the thing that made her genuinely different from every other strategist in the command center, was that she did not think about the Grand Armada as 40,000 ships. She thought about it as 40,000 command bridges, each one with a commander standing on it, who had been trained to follow orders, but who also had the ability to think independently. Same basic wiring that every thinking creature in the galaxy shared, the wiring that said, I want to live through this, and I want the people under my command to live through this too. That wiring was the real target. While Okafor worked, Yoshida ran the second phase of Iron Veil's deployment. The Warden-class drones were already moving, had been moving since the Grand Armada's departure from Imperial space was first detected, riding on pre-calculated vectors that used the gravitational dynamics of the fleet's own movement to carry them invisibly into the formation. Warden drones were small enough that the Empire sensors would read them as debris, as micrometeorite scatter, as the ordinary noise of space, and they had been designed with exactly this purpose in mind. Not to fight in the open, but to be already inside the fight before the fight knew it had started. 3,000 of them slipped into the Grand Armada's formation undetected. Over the 26 hours it took the fleet to cross the final distance to the Sol system. When the Grand Armada dropped out of FTL at the edge of the heliosphere, the tactical display in the command center updated instantly. Harlow saw 40,000 red markers bloom into existence on the solar system map, a wall of force that stretched across thousands of kilometers of space, and he also saw, rendered in quiet blue, the scattered positions of 3,000 Warden drones, distributed throughout the fleet's interior like seeds in a fruit. Nobody in the Grand Armada knew they were there. On the new Imperial flagship, a massive vessel called the Voice of Velkaran, a fleet sovereign named Reth Davar stood and looked at the distant yellow star and felt the particular satisfaction of commanding the most powerful military assembly in the known galaxy. He had been told that Vorokai's fleet had experienced an anomaly, had lost ships to unknown causes, and that a show of overwhelming and undeniable force would resolve the situation in the way overwhelming force always resolved things. He was preparing his own version of the ultimatum when Okafor's transmission reached him. It came in on all frequencies, calm and unhurried, in perfect Imperial standard without a translator's pause, and it said, "Fleet Sovereign Davar, we know your name because we have been listening to your internal communications since you crossed the Keth corridor boundary. We want you to understand that this is not a statement of hostility, but a statement of fact, so that what we say next is received in its proper context." Davar froze. "You are currently carrying, within your formation, 3,000 autonomous weapons platforms that have been in position for the last 19 hours. Every flagship in your fleet is targeted. Every command bridge is covered. We have done this, not to kill you, but to make sure that you hear what we are about to say in full, before you make any decisions." The bridge of the Voice of Velkaran was completely silent. "We did not fire on your first fleet because we wanted to destroy it. We fired because your ships crossed a boundary that we had established as a defensive perimeter, and they did so after we had declined your terms and asked you to leave. We do not want a war with the Celestial Empire. We do not want territory or resources or political standing. We want to be left alone, on our world, to continue the existence we have built here. This is not weakness. We are asking you as clearly as one civilization can ask another. Go home." Davar's hands were gripping the edge of his command console. He looked at his tactical display and saw nothing where the Warden drones were supposed to not be. But the transmission was coming from inside his formation, and that alone told him that the message was not a bluff. Then Okafor's voice came back one more time, and it said something that no species in the history of the Celestial Empire had ever said to an Imperial fleet. "You came here because you thought we were small. We are small, but small things have had 4 billion years on this planet to figure out how to survive things much larger than themselves. We have been eaten by monsters, and frozen by ice ages, and burned by our own sun's radiation, and we are still here. Still building, still watching the sky. You are not the first large thing to threaten us. You are only the first large thing to come from somewhere else. We suggest you go home, Fleet Sovereign, because we would very much prefer that today does not become the day we have to show you the rest of what we built." Vorukai had expected something, a second transmission, a follow-up offer, a desperate attempt to negotiate better terms, because that was what species did when they were afraid and trying not to show it. They filled the silence with noise, because silence was harder to maintain than words, when destruction was sitting in your sky, counting down the seconds. But Earth said nothing. The planet just kept turning, its lights visible from deep space, its radio signals continuing their endless cheerful outward broadcast of music and news and arguments about things that had nothing to do with the fleet waiting at the edge of their system. When the timer reached 0, Vorukai stood on the bridge of the Eternal Decree and gave the order with the same flat efficiency he had used 47 times before. First wave, 200 vessels, standard suppression pattern, begin approach to inner system. The 200 ships broke from formation smoothly, engines brightening against the dark, and began the long curve toward the inner planets. They moved in a pattern Vorukai had used so many times it was nearly automatic, a spreading crescent that would bring them into orbital range of Earth from multiple angles simultaneously, making any coordinated defense response nearly impossible. Commander Sela watched the formation on the tactical display and noted, out loud, that Earth's orbital sensors had almost certainly tracked the movement from the moment it began. "Good," Vorukai said. "Let them watch. Watching is the beginning of understanding, and understanding is the beginning of surrender." The 200 ships crossed the orbit of Uranus, then Saturn, moving at combat approach speed, their weapon systems warm and ready. It was a journey measured in hours, not minutes, and for those hours, the Eternal Decree held its position and watched the approach on long-range sensors with the patience of something that had never had a reason to hurry. Then the first wave crossed the orbit of Jupiter, and 11 seconds later, they were gone. Not destroyed in any way Vorukai's sensors could immediately recognize. No explosion, no energy flash, no debris spreading outward from the point of impact. 200 ships, each one a mountain of metal and power, simply ceased to register on any instrument the fleet possessed, as if they had been erased from the physical record of the universe, between one sensor sweep and the next. The bridge of the Eternal Decree went completely silent. Vorukai stared at the tactical display. The space where 200 ships had been was empty. Not damaged, not dark, not drifting. Empty, in the way that space was empty before anything had ever been there at all. "Report," he said, and his voice came out steady because he had trained it to be steady, regardless of what was happening inside him. The reports came back fast, and they all said the same thing in different technical language. There was nothing to report, because there was nothing there. The ships were not in any detectable state. They had not been shot, had not been hit by any identifiable weapon, had not experienced any measurable catastrophic event. They were simply absent from reality, in a way that the fleet's best scientific instruments did not have a category for. "Energy readings from the Earth system," Sela said quietly, and her voice had changed. The flat professional tone was still there, but something underneath it had shifted in a way that Vorukai noticed immediately. He walked to her station and looked at the readings himself. The numbers did not make immediate sense, so he looked at them again, and then the sense they were making reached him fully, and he stood very still for a moment that lasted several seconds. The energy output being detected from within the Sol system, from the planet's surface, from its moon, asteroid belt, from dozens of orbital points that had previously registered as nothing, was not the energy output of a primitive civilization. It was not even close. The combined energy signature being read from Ironvale's network was larger than the total output of the entire Dominion fleet operating at maximum combat capacity. It was the kind of number that belonged to a Type 2 civilization or above, a species that had mastered the full energy output of its star, and it had been sitting there invisible the entire time, hidden under false readings and careful disguise, waiting with the particular patience of something that had been built to wait. Vorukai turned away from the display and walked to the front of the bridge, looking out at the distant yellow star. The thing that had been moving in the back of his mind since he read Earth's first response had a name now. It was not quite fear, because he was too experienced and too disciplined for simple fear, was something more specific. The particular feeling of a commander who has walked into a room expecting to be the most dangerous thing in it, and discovered, before the door finished closing behind him, that he was not. In the United Earth Command Center beneath the Swiss Alps, Harlow was watching the same data from the other side. His weapons chief, a compact woman named Commander Rin Yoshida, had her hand near a console that could, with a single confirmation sequence, activate the next phase of Iron Veil's response. She looked at Harlow and waited. "Hold," Harlow said. "Sir, we have a clear tactical window," Yoshida said, not arguing, just stating a fact the way a professional stated facts. "I know," Harlow said. "Hold anyway." He understood something that the pure tactical calculation did not account for. Destroying the entire Dominion fleet was possible, was well within Iron Veil's current operational capacity, and would solve the immediate problem. With complete certainty, but a fleet that disappeared entirely left the Empire with no information and no lesson, only an absence, and an absence could be explained away as a malfunction or a navigation error. And explained away problems had a way of coming back bigger the second time. What Harlow wanted, what humanity needed, was not just a victory, it was a message that could not be misread. Dr. Okafor appeared at his shoulder, having read the same situation with different eyes. "He's sitting still," she said, looking at the display showing Vorokai's fleet holding position beyond Neptune. "He hasn't called for a retreat, and he hasn't advanced. He's thinking." "What do you think he's thinking?" Harlow asked. Okafor considered this for a moment. She had spent her entire career trying to understand how minds different from human minds processed information, and she had developed instincts that were more reliable than most people gave her credit. "He's thinking that something is wrong with his information," she said. "He came here expecting a certain kind of problem, and he found a different kind. Right now he is trying to fit what just happened into a model that explains it, without requiring him to completely rewrite what he believes about this mission. And he can't, because there isn't a version of his model that accounts for 200 ships vanishing in 11 seconds from a species his scouts rated as pre-contact." "How long before he asks for reinforcements?" Harlow asked. "Not long," Okafor said. "He's a soldier. When a problem gets bigger than expected, soldiers get more soldiers." Harlow nodded slowly. He had already anticipated this, and Iron Veil had already anticipated it before Harlow was born. The network's second-phase protocols had been designed specifically for the scenario where a first engagement prompted escalation rather than retreat. "Then we let him call," Harlow said. "And we make sure that when whatever he calls arrives, it understands something the First Fleet didn't." He looked at the empty space on the tactical display where 200 ships used to be, and then he looked at the planet on the screens behind him. Cities full of people who were going about their lives, who knew something was happening, but did not know the full shape of it yet, who were trusting that the people in this room were handling it. "They're going to send everything they have," Yoshida said. "Yes," Harlow agreed. "And we're going to be ready," Okafor said. It was not a question. Harlow looked at the display one more time, then turned and walked back toward the center of the room, where the real work of the next phase was already beginning. "We were born ready," he said. "We just never had the chance to show anyone." Every deep space monitoring station humanity had ever built lit up at once. The signals came in so fast and so loud that 3 separate early warning networks crashed under the data load, before anyone could even begin to process what they were seeing. And what they were seeing was 3,000 ships, each one larger than any man-made structure that had ever existed on Earth, sitting in a perfect formation just beyond the orbit of Neptune, like a wall built by something that did not worry about being seen. On Earth, a young astronomer named Peta Havili was doing routine maintenance on a radio telescope in New Zealand when every alarm on her console went off simultaneously. She stared at her screen for 4 full seconds before she picked up her phone and called the number she had been told, during her very first week on the job, to only call if something absolutely impossible happened. The person who answered already knew. Within 6 hours, every government on Earth had been contacted. Every military commander had been briefed. And the United Earth Command, a joint defense organization that most civilians knew existed, but assumed was mostly ceremonial, had activated its full emergency protocol for the first time in its 40-year history. The command center was buried 2 kilometers beneath the Swiss Alps, and it was not small. It stretched for nearly 3 kilometers in every direction, filled with screens and consoles and people who had spent their entire careers training for a moment that most of them had privately believed would never actually come. Secretary General Admiral James Harlow arrived at the command center 40 minutes after the first alert, and stood in front of the main display wall showing the full tactical picture of the Sol system. He was 63 years old, broad-shouldered, with a gray beard he kept trimmed short, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had decided a long time ago that panic was a luxury he could not afford. "Talk to me," he said. The room talked. Sensor data, ship counts, energy readings, gravitational displacement measurements, all of it pouring in faster than any human mind could absorb, which was why the analysis systems were already working to sort it into something useful. 3,000 vessels confirmed, said Colonel Yemi Adeyinka from the sensor station. Smallest vessel in the formation registers at approximately 4 kilometers in length. The flagship is estimated at 60 kilometers. They dropped out of FTL in a single coordinated transition, which means their navigation technology is significantly beyond anything we have modeled. "Any communications?" Harlow asked. "Coming in now, sir," said Dr. Sarah Okafor, Earth's lead xenolinguist, who had been on a video call from her university office in Lagos when the alert reached her, and had made it to the command center in record time, still carrying the coffee she had never put down. She was 38, sharp-eyed, and spoke 14 languages, which was about to become extremely relevant. The transmission came through on every frequency at once. It was a voice, deep and resonant and entirely calm, and it spoke first in a language no human had ever heard, then shifted smoothly through 11 more, before landing on English, then Mandarin, then Spanish, then Arabic, cycling through every major human language, with the ease of something that had done this before, many times, for many different species. The message was simple. The planet designated Earth was hereby claimed as a territory of the Celestial Empire under the authority of Sovereign Vel-Karan. All inhabitants were to stand down any military capability, submit to imperial census, and prepare for administrative transition. Compliance would result in a protected tributary status with basic rights preserved. Non-compliance would result in immediate and total pacification. Period of 72 hours was granted for deliberation and response. Then the transmission ended, and the command center was very quiet for a moment. Harlow looked at the display wall, showing 3,000 ships sitting in the dark beyond Neptune. And then he looked at the faces around the room. Some were pale, some were rigid with the effort of staying calm, and a very few, had a look that Harlow recognized because he had worn it himself for years. It was the look of someone thinking, finally. "Dr. Okafor," Harlow said, "how long do you need to prepare a response?" "I've already started," she said, still holding her coffee. What the Dominion fleet did not know, what Admiral Vorakai had no way of knowing, because his scouts had never looked beneath the surface of the planet, never scanned the ocean floors, never examined the interior of the asteroid belt with anything more than a cursory geological survey, was that Earth had a second. It had always had a second layer. 200 years ago, a small group of scientists and military strategists had looked at the mathematics of the universe and reached a conclusion that was uncomfortable but unavoidable. If life existed elsewhere, and the scale of the galaxy made it nearly certain that it did, then some of that life would eventually come looking, and there was no reason to assume it would come in peace. That conclusion had started a conversation, and that conversation had, over generations, become a program, and that program had, over more generations, become something vast and hidden and extraordinarily patient. It was called Project Iron Veil, and it had been operational for 40 years. Iron Veil was not a single weapon or a single base. It was a network, distributed across the entire solar system, buried and disguised, and built with one specific purpose in mind: to make sure that if something came for Earth, Earth would be ready to answer back with something it had not been expecting. The asteroid belt held 1,800 automated weapons platforms disguised as natural rock formations. The lunar surface concealed 3 massive railgun arrays under false crater floors. The ocean floors of Earth held quantum collapse generators that had taken 30 years to miniaturize to the point where they were actually useful. And in low orbit, disguised as dead satellites and space debris, sat 412 independent targeting stations capable of coordinating a system-wide response in under 1 second. The fleet outside Neptune was large. It was, by any normal measure, overwhelming. Iron Veil was larger. When Dr. Okafor's response was ready, Harlow read it once, nodded, and authorized the transmission. It went out on the same frequencies the Empire had used, and it was delivered in the same calm, steady tone, because Okafor understood that tone mattered as much as words when you were talking to something that had done this 47 times before. The message said, in the Empire's own primary language, and then in 17 others, "We have received your communication and considered your terms. The people of Earth decline. We wish you no harm and ask that you withdraw from our solar system. If you choose to remain, we will consider that a declaration of hostile intent and respond accordingly. The choice is yours." There was no threat beyond the statement, no boasting, no listing of capabilities, no attempt to bluff, just a flat, simple, direct response from a species that had been told it had 72 hours to decide whether to surrender. It had taken them 6. On the bridge of the Eternal Decree, Admiral Vorakai read the response twice, and then a third time. Not because it was complicated, but because it contained something he had not encountered in 47 campaigns. It contained no fear. He set the message down and looked out at the black space between his fleet and the distant yellow star that Earth called its sun. And for the first time in a very long career, something moved in the back of his mind that he did not immediately have a name for. The Celestial Empire had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years, and in all that time, not a single civilization had ever said no to them. Their halls were tall and golden, built from the bones of dead worlds they had conquered long before anyone alive could remember. And their emperor sat on a throne that was older than most stars in the outer spiral. His name was Sovereign Velkarin, and he had lived for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be afraid. On the day that changed everything, Velkarin was sitting in his war chamber, surrounded by 12 of his highest generals, all of them dressed in deep violet armor that caught the light of 3 artificial suns burning inside the chamber's ceiling. It was a room designed to make anyone standing in it feel small, and it worked on everyone except the Emperor himself. A scout commander named Giral stepped forward and placed a holographic map in the center of the room. The map showed a small, spinning orb, blue planet sitting at the very edge of the outer spiral, tucked away in a quiet corner of the galaxy where nobody important ever looked. "This is the target, Your Eternal Sovereignty," Giral said, keeping his eyes low, because looking directly at the Emperor for too long had consequences that nobody talked about openly. "The planet is called Earth by its inhabitants, a species known as humans, and it sits directly above the Keth gravitational corridor, which, as you know, is the richest unmined mineral passage in the last 4 sectors." Velkarin leaned forward slightly, just slightly, because emperors did not lean, and looked at the small blue dot on the map. "What do we know about the humans?" he asked. Giral pulled up a secondary display. It showed grainy footage of human cities, human roads, human spacecraft that barely made it past their own moon, and human news broadcasts full of arguments about things that did not matter to anyone outside their own atmosphere. "They are young, Sovereignty. Their civilization is less than 10,000 years old in any meaningful form. They have no galactic alliances, no formal standing in any intergalactic court, and their most advanced military vessel is a chemical propulsion craft that could not survive contact with our slowest patrol ship. They are, by every measurable standard, a pre-contact species, with no awareness of what exists beyond their own solar system. There was a low ripple of laughter around the war chamber, not loud, because generals of the Celestial Empire were too dignified for loud laughter, but it was there, quiet and sharp and dismissive. Velkarin did not laugh. He simply looked at the blue planet for a few more seconds, and then leaned back in his throne. "Send Vorakai," he said. Every general in the room straightened at the name. War Admiral Thane Vorakai was the Empire's most decorated commander, a being who had brought 47 civilizations to their knees, with nothing more than the shadow of his fleet, and a coldly delivered ultimatum. He had never lost a campaign, had never needed a second attempt, and had never once faced a species that did not collapse the moment his ships filled their sky. Tell him to take the Dominion fleet. 3,000 vessels should be more than sufficient, and offer the humans a standard surrender package. If they comply, they become a tributary world under imperial law. If they refuse, he is authorized to remove the problem entirely. Giral nodded and turned to leave, but the Emperor spoke one more time. "Make it quick. That corridor needs to be operational before the next cycle. And I don't want to spend political energy on a world that does not even have a seat at any galactic table." That was the entire conversation. No debate, no second opinions, no strategic review. Earth was discussed for less time than it took Velkarin to finish his morning drink, and then the war chamber moved on to other, more important business. 3 days later, War Admiral Thane Vorakai stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Decree, and watched as 3,000 ships fell into formation around him. It was a sight that had broken the spirit of every enemy he had ever faced, because there was something about that many ships moving as one that reached into the deepest part of any thinking creature, and whispered that resistance was not just foolish, but impossible. Vorakai was tall, even by Imperial standards, with pale gray skin and 4 eyes that could process visual data faster than most species could blink. He had been a soldier for over 800 years, and he carried himself with the quiet certainty of someone who had never once doubted the outcome of anything. He looked at the star map showing the route to the Sol system, and felt, if he was being truthful, nothing. Not excitement, not anticipation, not even mild interest. This was, by every measure, a routine assignment, the kind of thing a commander of his rank was given when the Empire needed something handled cleanly and without drama. His second-in-command, Commander Sela, stepped up beside him and looked at the same map. "Intelligence says their most advanced city has a population of around 30 million, she said, "and their total planetary military force numbers somewhere between 20 and 30 million active personnel, all ground-based or low-orbit capable." "Armed with what?" Vorakai asked. "Chemically propelled projectiles, some directed energy weapons in early stages, nuclear warheads in moderate quantity," Sela said, and she said it the way someone might read a shopping list, flatly, without emotion, because none of the information was alarming in any way. Vorakai nodded slowly. He had faced civilizations with nuclear capability before. It was a common stage in a species' development, and dangerous window where they were powerful enough to destroy themselves, but not powerful enough to threaten anyone else. 72 hours, he said. "We give them 72 hours from the moment we drop out of FTL. Standard ultimatum, broadcast in all detectable languages. If they comply, we proceed with standard occupation. If they don't, we begin with the largest population centers." "And if they try to fight?" Sela asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and was only asking as a formality. Vorakai turned away from the map and walked toward the center of the bridge. "They won't," he said simply. "They never do, not really. They might make noise, they might make speeches, but when 3,000 ships appear above your world, something switches off inside a species. The survival instinct overrides everything else. It always does. The Eternal Decree's engines fired, deep and resonant, and the Dominion fleet began to move. Somewhere across the galaxy, on a small blue planet that nobody important had ever thought about twice, the lights were on, and people were living their lives, going to work, raising children, arguing about politics, watching the night sky with old telescopes, and wondering, the way humans had always wondered, whether anything was out there. Something was coming, and it had already decided the answer before the question was even asked. What it had not decided, what it could not have known to decide, was whether the question was going to go the way it expected.